Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to Anderson House here in Washington, D.C. My name is Andrew Outen and I'm the Historical Programs Manager for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati. The American Revolution Institute promotes knowledge and appreciation for the achievement of American independence, fulfilling the aim of the Continental Army officers and their French counterparts who founded the Society of the Cincinnati in 1783 to perpetuate the memory and legacy of the American Revolution. In addition to tonight's lecture, the American Revolution Institute fulfills that aim by supporting advanced study, developing exhibitions and other historical programs and tours, advocating historic preservation, and providing resources to classrooms nationwide that benefit teachers, students, and scholars alike. Since 1938, the Society of the Cincinnati has done all of this work from right here at its headquarters, Anderson House, a National Historic Landmark that was completed in 1905 as the winter residence of Lars and Isabel Anderson. Tonight's lecture, a program made possible in part by a generous gift from the Massachusetts Society of the Cincinnati, features Dr. Max Edelson discussing the Surveyor's Eyes, mapping empire in the era of the American Revolution. In the second half of the 18th century, British surveyors came to North America and the West Indies in unprecedented numbers. Their images of coastlines, forts, and frontiers helped win the war with France and pictured a triumphant world. Tonight, Dr. Edelson will examine how the American Revolution shattered that vision of peace, commerce, and settlement by showing how those who were once tasked to promote an expansive American empire were soon forced to apply their knowledge and skills to make war on American colonists. Max Edelson is a professor of history at the University of Virginia. His studies surround the history of British America and the Atlantic world, and his research examines space, place, and culture in colonial North America and the Caribbean. He is the author of two books, Plantation Enterprise in Colonial South Carolina and the New Map of Empire, How Britain Imagined America Before Independence, both of which were published by the University of Harvard Press in 2006 and 2017, respectively. Additionally, Dr. Edelson is the co-developer of a dynamic visualization tool for historic map collections, Map Scholar, that was funded by a digital implementation grant in 2012, and the co-director of the University of Virginia's Early American Seminar, an ongoing research seminar jointly sponsored by the Corcoran Department of History, the Jefferson Scholars Foundation, and the International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello. Before I turn things over to Dr. Edelson, however, I would be remiss if I didn't cover the usual housekeeping items for our virtual audience attending on Zoom this evening. Following tonight's lecture, there will be a question and answer session, so please feel free to submit your questions for Dr. Edelson at any point during the presentation by using the Q&A function that can be found at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to incorporate them with our live audience questions. Should you have any technical related questions or comments, those can be submitted using the chat function, and one of our staff members will be monitoring that and will do their best to assist you. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming to Anderson House, Dr. Max Edelson.
Thanks for coming, everyone. I want to thank Andrew and everyone else here for inviting me to this event and making it possible. And this is a special occasion for me because in the last year or so, I have been steeped in looking at some extraordinary map collections. And today's comments are really my reflections on what I'm seeing in these rich map collections. In November, I joined a remarkable group of scholars at George Washington's Mount Vernon for a symposium to admire and discuss the Richard H. Brown Revolutionary War map collection. In Charlottesville, I've spent the better part of the last year examining the Seymour I. Schwartz collection of North American maps, another recent gift that has brought a trove of hundreds of maps and rare books to UVA. It's become the focus of my teaching and my work with students as well. In this lecture, I want to give you a key to understand what makes so many of these maps of the end of the colonial period so compelling. They reflect what I'm calling the surveyor's eye. The surveyor's eye saw geography from a military perspective. It sought to reveal strategic places in high resolution. It zoomed in on visible features of the terrain to reveal the human scale of engagement with the landscape. Its images are marked by crisp lines and topographic relief that seem tailor-made to tell stories about war. With such maps, one can narrate the progress of troops across a detailed geography. This evening, I want to show how maps from this era reveal the influences of military surveying, a tradition that shaped the look of 18th century maps and the ways in which map viewers engaged with America as a place. Across two expansive wars and two transformative peace treaties, the surveyor's eye changed the image of America in the British Atlantic world. It is impossible to understand Revolutionary War maps without understanding their connections to maps that came before the Revolution. It is important, in my view, not to be too doctrinaire about the places, times, and maps that count as revolutionary. To tell the story of the American Revolution, it makes sense to feature a map like this, Sayer and Bennett's Seat of War in New England. This was an image that pictured troops in motion across the highways of Massachusetts in June 1775, converging on Roxbury, Cambridge, Charlestown, and the occupied port of Boston. It emerged from a copperplate press in London in September, just a few months after the events it depicts. But some 2 decades before Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill, cartography had already shifted to favor the military surveyor's eye. From the mid-1750s, the British mapping of America increased dramatically. These maps were different from those that came before. They rendered coastlines with precision derived from rigorous on-site observations. They populated flat paper landscapes with shading that brought cliffs and hillsides into 3 dimensions, and they magnified the human geography of colonial settlement, revealing the outlines of cultivated fields and even the footprints of individual buildings. In short, British military and imperial surveyors recreated early America as a world that you could see as if you were there. Officials planning colonies and campaigns from London used these maps to visualize distant frontiers. And those who might never leave the comfort of their parlors or libraries in England traveled in their imaginations to these remote places on which the fate of the British Empire depended. Britain sent teams of surveyors along with military forces to North America and the West Indies in the 1750s, 1760s, and 1770s. These mapmakers produced a remarkable surge of new maps, plans, and charts. Before these great wars for American empire, Britain's mapping of America was episodic, uneven, and infrequent. When King Charles II created the Council on Trade and Plantations in 1672, the king charged the Lords of Trade to, in his words, procure exact maps, plats, or charts of all and every of our said plantations abroad. They began by acquiring maps produced by others to illustrate these far-flung places for the king, from Newfoundland to Barbados and beyond. Some of these maps were original manuscripts that codified the working knowledge of long-distance navigators. Others were well-regarded publications produced on copperplate printing presses in London, Amsterdam, Paris, and Frankfurt. England's first official map archive was derivative. It did not involve the state in making its own maps as a regular and organized activity. The Board of Trade, the council that was overseeing Britain's overseas possessions, sent questionnaires to the colonies, asking for new maps to show boundaries, populations, and strategic corridors. Sometimes colonial governors complied with these requests, providing additional maps alongside written reports. Long before Britain employed cartography as a tool of empire, its great rivals, Spain and France, had created active cartographic services that mapped American places. Throughout the colonial period, British authorities relied on commercial mapmakers to disseminate official and unofficial images of British America to broad audiences. We can get a sense of this wartime cartographic surge in map production by looking at the official maps received by the Board of Trade in the 18th century. I've examined one important collection of official images, 144 maps from the Colonial Office 5 record series at the UK National Archives. This series is one that extracts cartographic materials that were sent back from the colonies to authorities in London. Only 25 of these maps date from before 1750. In other words, the first century and a half of colonial history accounted for less than a fifth of all the maps received in London. In the final 25 years of the colonial period, 119 maps were sent from America, about 80% of all the maps extracted from this sample of official correspondence. The reason for this cartographic surge is clear. The arrival of trained Army and Admiralty surveyors during the 1750s and 1760s brought a new capacity for mapmaking to North America and the West Indies. During the 7 Years' War, known as the French and Indian War in North America, Great Britain jump-started a mini cartographic revolution. Colonial governors drew on the expertise of these military surveyors to illustrate their reports to Whitehall. But the real growth in the number of maps dispatched from America to Britain took place after the Treaty of Paris in 1763, when the British state began undertaking its own systematic surveys of its American possessions after the war. More surveyors arrived during the American Revolutionary War, making maps that planned campaigns and documented battles. As the 7 Years' War began, a series of important regional maps of British North America appeared in print that drew from these military surveys. These maps brought together deepening knowledge of the Atlantic coast, where growing colonial populations laid claim to an expanding zone of settlement. These new maps linked this knowledge of well-settled places with new information from survey expeditions into the interior. John Green's new map of Nova Scotia made an aggressive assertion of British sovereignty over the contested lands of the maritime Northeast in 1755. As British and French commissioners wrangled over where British Nova Scotia ended and French Acadia began, this map argued for the continuity of British land claims from the Atlantic coast to the St. Lawrence River. Green's map of the inhabited part of New England, also from 1755, makes another claim of British power, this time based on the region's surging populations and the imposition of civil order. Although the topography of New England's landscape is sketched lightly across this map surface, its civil geography imposed a dense matrix of provincial, county, and township boundaries across the region. Lewis Evans' general map of the Middle Colonies connected new knowledge of the continent to long-established jurisdictions closer to the coast. Evans' own participation in a 1749 diplomatic mission to Iroquois country added new specificity to a map that reached deep into the interior. Such a map was a prospectus for future colonization. It helped Britons at home and abroad imagine mainland colonies as empires in miniature, poised to expand into a vast continental frontier. Joshua Fry and Peter Jefferson pictured Virginia in similar ways in a map first published in 1753. They brought together the knowledge they had accumulated as boundary surveyors and land speculators to reveal Western landscapes. This map's cartouche celebrated Virginia's signature staple commodity, tobacco, and made no attempt to conceal how British America's most populous colony depended on African slavery for its wealth. Yet the map's innovation was not its representation of the Chesapeake Bay or its connection to the Atlantic economy. Here, the interior appears for the first time less as a stylized jumble of mountains and more as a place to be claimed and colonized. Coherent ridges separate lush river valleys, already named and enclosed by provincial boundaries, ready for settler occupation. To the south, surveyor William de Brom produced a masterpiece in 1757. His map of South Carolina and a part of Georgia charted the expanding plantation landscape of the coastal Lowcountry with startling new precision. De Brom georeferenced the property boundary maps his office had surveyed to make grants of land along the Combahee, Coosawhatchee, and Savannah rivers. Enslaved Africans remade these fertile swamplands into productive fields that generated record harvests of rice, South Carolina's staple commodity. The map's cartouche pictured enslaved indigo makers beating and cutting indigo dye, which was fast becoming a second lucrative export from the colony. A finely delineated network of rivers reaches from this repressive, productive coastal plain into the Carolina backcountry, where new townships were surveyed to anchor new settlements. This picture of the Southeast suggests that landscape landscapes created in the coastal zone will expand, spreading slavery, plantations, and profits along new riversides in the interior in the future. This map held out the prospect that these blank spaces in the interior would become someday as densely inscribed as the plantation coast. Together, these regional maps showcased a history of British colonization in North America. They brought together official records of landholdings, boundaries, and civil jurisdictions with knowledge gained from new exploratory journeys. Together, they staked a strong British claim to possession and articulated a desire for territorial expansion. By the middle decades of the 18th century, British North America was no longer a collection of separate colonies. Instead, it appeared on these regional maps, all published in the mid-1750s, as a continental empire, one that was deeply entrenched and poised for further expansion. The most celebrated American map of the century was produced during this fruitful decade for colonial cartography. John Mitchell's A Map of the British and French Dominions in North America. This map stitched together these regional views of British North America into a continental vision of empire. Mitchell's map projected bold British claims to sovereignty over virtually all of Eastern North America. The head of Britain's Board of Trade, the Earl of Halifax, personally recruited Mitchell to undertake the map, gave him access to Britain's official archive of manuscripts, and when these proved wanting, Halifax commanded colonial governors to draft new maps of their provinces that John Mitchell could compile into this state-of-the-art synthesis. Mitchell's map is a fantasy of dominion. Its charter boundary lines cross territories still inhabited and controlled by native societies. It anticipated that the rapid reproduction of American settler populations would soon extend jurisdictions westward. Bolstered by the credibility that came with compiling this manuscript record of settlement, the map pictured a mainland empire reaching across North America. These maps of America, published as the 7 Years' War began, illustrate Britain's imperial ambitions, but also reveal the limits of its geographic knowledge. When they arrived to challenge the French command of the continent, British officers realized that the maps they had were simply too vague to guide the deployment of troops in the field. In institutional terms, the British military lagged its rivals on the continent in the practice of high-resolution military mapping. It was just beginning to develop standards, practices, and personnel needed to create truly useful military maps. A clear vision for military mapping was forged by General William Roy in Scotland a decade before, in the 1740s. Charged to create new military-grade maps of the rebellious Scottish Highlands, Roy applied the most sophisticated methods for topographic mapping to this strategic challenge. Because a commander never knew where forces might have to be moved across the landscape to quash an uprising or pursue guerrilla fighters, ideal maps pictured every topographic detail of a contested territory. With such maps at hand, a commander could move troops to any place at any moment. The maps Roy created in Scotland set a new standard for high-resolution topographic mapping. Georg Ludwig learned the art and science of military mapping as a lieutenant in the army of the Duchy of Saxe in Germany. He moved to Paris, where young Lieutenant Ludwig changed his name to Georges-Louis Le Rouge, and by 1740 became one of France's most prolific map publishers. This map documents a strategically important place with a bloody history. The Isthmus of Chignecto was one of the most contested places in the Atlantic world. The French insisted that it marked the boundary between Acadia and Nova Scotia. The British disagreed. After years of attacks and counterattacks, a fleet of British warships and transports disgorged 2,000 troops to decide the issue in 1755. They captured Fort Beausejour and drove the French out, a critical early victory in the contest for Canada. Le Rouge's map acknowledges this victory by noting the new British name for the captured fort, Fort Cumberland. This image features the key elements of military topographic mapping. It is a picture of the landscape divided into riverside lowlands and wooded highlands, cultivated fields and swampy pastures. The dikes and irrigation channels for which Acadian farmers were famous create landmarks that show this landscape at a human scale. Shading with hachures pictures the hilly terrain of the peninsula. The careful delineation of rivers and roadways show how troops might cross this territory and where it remained impassable. Ideal military surveys pictured the terrain at a scale of 1 or 2 inches to the mile, a resolution that revealed details such as buildings, gardens, and fence lines. Instructors at the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich and the Royal Naval Academy in Portsmouth were beginning to teach budding engineers how to make maps and charts to this exacting new standard. British regiments also became a magnet for skilled engineers from European armies with more advanced surveying and mapping traditions. We can find many non-English or anglicized names among the creators and contributors to many Revolutionary era maps, including Samuel Holland, William de Brom, Charles Blaskowitz, Claude Joseph Sauthier, and JFW de Beer. These names reflect this migration of European mapping talent to the British military in this era. Military surveyors arrived in America to fight the 7 Years' War with pens, paper, and compasses. They planned routes through the woods, designed fortifications, and recorded the results of battlefield engagements. Their high-resolution manuscript maps reported the progress of the war to authorities in Britain. After the forts were built and the battles won or lost, officials shared these hand-drawn maps with commercial publishers, especially the prolific Thomas Jeffreys. Jeffreys was among the first London map publishers who used his title, Geographer to the King, to obtain manuscript maps from the battlefield. He engraved their images on copper plates and printed them for public consumption. In 1768, Thomas Jeffreys and his fellow publisher, Robert Sayer, released a massive atlas that compiled American maps, many of which were created as military instruments during the 7 Years' War. The general topography of North America and the West Indies tells the story of Great Britain's triumph over France. This overstuffed atlas of American places invited Britons to revisit the military victories celebrated in 1763. The general topography atlas dazzles the eye with the immensity of new territory that had been acquired at such a high cost of blood and treasure. This series of index maps I'm about to show you shows the coverage of the atlas's 93 maps, plans, and charts. At the broadest scale, general maps like John Green's A Chart of North and South America picture the hemisphere from the Atlantic edges of Europe and Africa to the fringes of Kamchatka and Australia. British America occupies one of these 6 charts, titled Chart of the Atlantic Ocean, with the British, French, and Spanish settlements in North America and the West Indies. From this place at the center of the New World, British sea power was positioned to take command of the whole. If we remove these grand hemispheric maps from the index, we can see the outlines of the important medium-scale maps of British America that demonstrated command over North American regions and Caribbean islands. Remove these, and what remains are the military maps that surveyors created during the war to fortify strategic sites and stage attacks by land and sea. The general topography was a patriotic celebration of Britain's great victory in America, but it did not paste over some of the nation's most devastating defeats. The humbling opening chapter of the war began with General Edward Braddock's doomed march into the Pennsylvania backcountry to evict the French from Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Ohio River. The tale of Braddock's catastrophic advance begins by showing the arrangement of the general's flying column of 1,300 men arrayed along the road they had carved through the forest in 1755. On July 9th, French and native forces routed Braddock's troops, leaving Braddock dead and most of his officers and men dead or wounded. We don't know much about Robert Orme's training as a surveyor. We do know that this 30-year-old British Army lieutenant who created these images served as one of Braddock's aides de camp and created an indelible record of a painful defeat. His plans create a powerful illusion for the viewer who turn the pages of Jeffreys' general topography. From the scouts and cavalry officers in the vanguard at the front of this long line to the baggage carts at the back, these images position us as viewers hovering above the action. And yet a closer look shows us that these trees aren't real. They are just a stylized pattern, sort of representing woodlands. We don't see humans, wagons, horses, or artillery pieces, but rather unit symbols in perfect alignment along this straight, cleared path through the woods. When combined with other maps, they tell a coherent story of defeat, On Orm's plan of the field of battle and disposition of the troops as they were on the march at the time of the attack, we zoom out from the high-resolution picture of Braddock's Road to take in his objective, Fort Duquesne, you can see up here in the corner. We see the troops approaching, frozen in time, just before the bullets flew. As the title puts it, as they were on the march at the time of the attack. Orm's use of shading reveals the topographic relief that military surveyors were trained to show. Britain had hoped to drive France from its frontier stronghold, but instead suffered a grave defeat at the Battle of Monongahela. Orm and Jeffreys retold this national tragedy in a series of nested images at multiple scales of representation. Such images, once engraved, arranged, titled, and annotated, and presented along with other maps in this atlas, immersed British readers within a remote and vital American place. Robert Orm created these images to help plan Braddock's march. He revised them to create a patriotic record of a notorious military defeat for British audiences. He even drafted a manuscript journal of the events that he experienced, although this account wasn't published during his lifetime. Orm set out to do what many trained military engineers did during the 18th century. They used their skills to make money and gain renown in the hopes of promotion. Trained mapmakers knew they could use their skills to advance their careers, and Robert Orm was definitely a man on the make. In addition to producing maps that Jeffreys published, Joshua Reynolds painted his portrait. It shows Orm in his uniform as a member of Braddock's Coldstream Guards. This image helped him capitalize on his celebrity as a survivor of this famous defeat. We see Orm as a tragic, heroic figure here, full of swagger and confidence. Although of humble rank, this picture emphasized Orm as a man of skill and sensibility, a modern officer whose talents promised to advance him to wealth and renown. Orm resigned his army commission in 1756. Then he eloped with Audrey Townsend, the volatile daughter of Charles Townsend, a senior British official who would play a crucial role in the coming of the American Revolution. As Orm recognized, high-resolution military maps were valuable because they allowed commanders to see contested territories from within the landscape. This quality also made such maps highly compelling to audiences who wanted to experience these distant places on which so much depended for themselves. The war now kindled in America, wrote Samuel Johnson in 1756, has incited us to survey and delineate the immense wastes of the Western continent by stronger motives than mere science or curiosity could have ever supplied. Britons pored over images of remote American places during and after the 7 Years' War. British armchair generals read published accounts of battles and located the scenes of action on newly published maps. These, in Johnson's words, enabled the imagination to wander over the lakes and mountains to visualize a grand and expansive New World empire. From 1758, Britons read yearly summaries of the progress of the conflict in Edmund Burke's History of the Present War, a recurring essay published in the Annual Register. They bought newly published maps to see the places that Burke described. Not every reader could afford the 6 guineas it cost to purchase the General Topography of North America when it came out in 1768. But many more could afford individual sheet maps and cheaper collections. From 1763, they could inspect 30 fort plans reduced from actual surveys published in John and Mary Ann Roke's A Set of Plans and Forts in America. Like Jeffreys, John Roke used his connections to British officials to get access to original military manuscripts so that he could engrave them for printing. He dedicated his 1750 chart of Chebucto Harbor in Nova Scotia to Lord Halifax, the powerful president of the Board of Trade, who founded Halifax as a center of British power in the North Atlantic. There was nothing surreptitious about this practice. Britain did not have a state map publishing office, and senior officials like Halifax approved the release of military maps in print. These precisely rendered images demonstrated British mastery over distant places to French and British audiences alike. They also encouraged readers at home and abroad to engage in patriotic reflection about the costs and benefits of imperial warfare. In 1769, John Knox explained the purpose of his new book, An Historical Journal of the Campaigns in North America. He hoped to, quote, afford the most sublime of all entertainments to the generous mind by placing before him past scenes of glory in which he has either shared personally, that is, if he was a soldier or an officer in the battles, or shall share in the review by patriotic sympathy. Those who subscribed to this book ahead of time saw their names printed in the copies they received when it was published. Here, between the covers of Knox's account of the military campaigns of the 7 Years' War, they joined aristocrats who had commanded troops in the field. When they opened these books, they could experience these scenes of British glory and defeat vicariously. Such texts and maps gave British readers and viewers a way to participate from their armchairs and with their eyes and imaginations in the story of empire as a collective national enterprise. For more than a decade after the peace of 1763, audiences clamored for maps and accounts of the 7 Years' War. As we've seen, Georges-Louis Le Rouge published his map of the Isthmus of Chignecto in Paris in 1755. In the same year, Thomas Jeffreys obtained a copy of this French map and re-engraved his own copy of it, complete with new annotations and an English title. A large and particular plan of Chignecto Bay and the circumjacent country with the forts settlements of the French till dispossessed by the English in June 1755. Jeffreys included this copied map in his general topography of 1768. His version of Le Rouge's map retained these finely rendered coastlines, the soundings, the carefully engraved presentation of the topographic relief in this landscape of fields, hills, and meandering rivers. Jeffreys also added in a tidy engraved script a written narrative of the events of the battle. This was an invitation to viewers to read the narrative and trace their fingers along the surface of the map to locate the places it described. Jeffreys described how a force of over 2,400 men under the command of Colonel Monckton arrived at the British Fort St. Lawrence on June 1st, 1755. This force crossed the river Missaquash, where British troops took fire from a French blockhouse. The superior British force overwhelmed the French outpost, which the French put to the torch as they retreated to Fort Beausejour. The British followed, set up their cannon, and began firing on the fort on the 13th. By the 16th, the French had capitulated. On the 17th, Colonel Scott took possession of the fort, hoisted the English flag, and renamed it Fort Cumberland in honor of the Duke of Cumberland, the younger son of George II and one of Britain's chief war planners. The rest of Jeffreys' text summarizes the aftermath of the battle, the ordnance that was captured, the soldiers and civilians taken prisoner, and the numbers of dead and wounded. Jeffreys' narrative tells the story of the unfortunate Ensign Hay, who was captured by Indians and taken to the French fort. There, while eating breakfast with his captors, he died along with 3 French officers, casualties of a well-aimed British cannonball. As the fort fell, the French lost 8 officers and 51 soldiers. 3 Micmac Indians allied with the French died in the attack, including their sachem. When Thomas Manty published his History of the Late War in North America and the Islands of the West Indies in 1772, this map was the first of more than a dozen military maps and charts that folded out of the volume to illustrate its narrative accounts. Manty offered a detailed 5-page narrative that told the story of the successful British campaign to take Fort Beausejour and force a French evacuation. This image began as a French military manuscript. As a published image, it enabled the French and then the English to take stock of the events in this remote corner of the North American Northeast as the 7 Years' War began. And years later, it resurfaced again to illustrate a definitive historical account that encouraged British readers to relive these events. Such maps helped readers imagine this remote place and what it looked like to the troops who passed through it. At its most granular, this map described the experience of war at the scale of the human body. Among the casualties for the British was a Major Preble, who, as Jeffreys' narrative described it, received a slight wound in the shoulder, and Ensign Tongue was wounded in the thigh. Military maps began as instruments of war, but they had a prominent afterlife as published maps that allowed British readers to experience the war for themselves in a way that was visceral, sensory, and compelling. At the end of the 7 Years' War, Britain's most experienced military surveyors remained in America to undertake new surveys of acquired territory. Samuel Holland, a trained Dutch surveyor, came to North America as an officer in the Royal American Regiment. His surveys aided in the capture of the French Fort Louisbourg in 1758. He taught Admiralty surveyor James Cook how to conduct plane table coastal surveys, skills that Cook would apply during his famous voyages to the South Pacific. Together, Holland and Cook drafted new charts of the St. Lawrence River that proved vital to the successful British conquest of Quebec in 1759. Samuel Holland joined other surveyors to create new high-resolution maps of occupied Canada. This performance earned him the attention of the Board of Trade. In 1764, they appointed him Surveyor General for the Northern District for their new General Survey of North America. His first task was to survey the island of St. John in the Gulf of St. Lawrence to the same exacting standards. Now called Prince Edward Island, the island of St. John was an early focal point for the Board of Trade's program of planned colonization in America after the 7 Years' War. If Britain could populate this island with colonists, the plan went, they could secure this region from any future attempts by France to reclaim it. By inhabiting St. John, they could implant British power permanently at the point of entry into what was now British Canada. They charged Samuel Holland and his assistant surveyors to survey this island, assess its suitability for agriculture and fishing, and divide it into massive 20,000-acre townships. In 1767, these townships were awarded by ballot to petitioners who promised to develop each of them into prosperous places of settlement. This published map proclaimed to the world that Britain was determined to defend its new frontiers with aggressive schemes of colonization. Far to the south, in the Gulf of Mexico, the Admiralty ordered Captain George Galt to survey the Gulf Coast, now claimed as part of the new British colonies of East and West Florida. Galt's survey of Pensacola established safe navigation into this sheltered harbor, ideally situated to project British sea power into the Gulf of Mexico and serve as a base for trade with Spanish America. Like many maps and charts created to secure British territories after 1763, this one was engraved for publication in J.F.W. de Beer's Atlantic Neptune Atlas. Beyond this precise new picture of the coast, Galt's maps sketched in the topography of the interior. As in the island of St. John, British officials granted townships and other land grants to prospective colonists, hoping to secure this new acquisition by encouraging its settlement. From 1764 to 1771, William de Brom charted the coast of peninsular Florida for the Board of Trade. As the Surveyor General for the Southern District, his task was to survey Florida's Atlantic coast and identify river inlets that might make good sites for new plantation settlements. De Brom's surveys of the St. Johns River around St. Augustine sparked a land boom that drew speculators to claim tracts of Florida land, the first of many overheated real estate schemes for which the Sunshine State has become famous, maybe notorious. His new surveys of the Florida Keys were the first to establish safe channels of navigation in this notoriously dangerous area for navigation. This German version of a chart from the Atlantic Neptune Atlas synthesizes George Galt's surveys of the Gulf Coast with de Brom's charts of the Atlantic coast and the Keys. Together, they helped Britain lay claim to new colonies with authoritative geographic knowledge. In the Caribbean, the Treaty of Paris ceded Dominica, St. Vincent, Grenada, and Tobago to Great Britain. The British plan for these islands was to rapidly develop them as new centers for African slavery and sugar production. The Ceded Island Land Commission sent surveyors to each of these islands to create comprehensive property maps. They divided every acre fit for cultivation into a numbered tract. These tracts were auctioned off to the highest bidder in London in the 1760s. In 1776, Chief Surveyor John Byers published a series of maps of the Ceded Islands. Drawn at the high-resolution scale of a half mile to the inch, these maps divided these tropical islands into mountainous interiors and arable, farmable coastal plains. They demonstrated tract by tract how Britain claimed and wanted to profit from these new sugar colonies. A couple of years after these Ceded Island maps appeared in print in London, Georges-Louis Lerouge incorporated them into a new collection of 13 Caribbean maps. Just as Thomas Jeffries had copied Lerouge's map of Chignecto in 1755, Lerouge returned the favor, creating new versions of Byers and Jeffries maps and publishing them in Paris in 1778. Although these maps originated to advance Britain's strategic and political aims, in Le Rouge's hands, they became a tantalizing new images for French audiences. These new high-resolution maps of the Caribbean enabled French map viewers to reach across the ocean in their imaginations and picture these exotic, brutal, and productive places over which rival empires contended. British surveyors spent the 1760s and 1770s mapping territories in America in the hopes of defending, populating, and encircling a vast Atlantic empire. But when the rupture of the American War of Independence broke out, new military views of coastlines, islands, and interiors mobilized this knowledge for a very different purpose: to make war on America. Charles Blaskowitz served as an assistant surveyor to Samuel Holland and worked on the General Survey of North America. In 1764, he arrived on the coast of Rhode Island to chart it for the survey. A decade later, on the eve of the Revolutionary War, he returned with a new surveying team to perfect his charts plan of Newport. He undertook to map the countryside around Rhode Island, at first at the invitation of the colony's principal farmers, whom he listed by name in the published chart. And also down here, not only are the names of the principal farmers here, there's a kind of promotional description of the colony of Rhode Island and how wonderful it is as a place of settlement. Blaskowitz sang Rhode Island's praises. He noted its history of religious toleration, its delightful summers, and its many advantages for commerce, husbandry, and agriculture. But before Blaskowitz could publish his chart, the Revolutionary War disrupted this narrative of colonial development. On December 6, 1776, following years of violent resistance to customs officials in Rhode Island, British Major General Sir Henry Clinton sent an expeditionary force that invaded Newport. Clinton used a manuscript copy of Blaskowitz's chart to organize the town's occupation by 7,000 soldiers. When William Faden published this map in 1778, he dedicated the chart to Hugh, Earl Percy, the commander Clinton left behind to defend the town. New annotations located the works and batteries raised by the Americans in their failed stand against the assault. These and other images of revolutionary engagement appeared in Faden's new compilation of American maps, the North American Atlas. It is one of many examples of Revolutionary War map collections that show the abrupt shift of imperial mapping in the late 1770s. Britain's new maps of empire, created to develop the empire through colonization, were quickly repurposed to enable British forces to conquer rebellious American colonies. In the second half of the 18th century, British surveyors came to North America and the West Indies in unprecedented numbers. Their images of coastlines, forts, and frontiers helped win the war with France and pictured a triumphant British Atlantic world. The American Revolution shattered this vision of peace, commerce, and settlement. Once tasked to promote an expansive American empire, military mapmakers applied their knowledge and used their skills to make war on American colonists. These reflections on these maps emerged from my investigation of these two new map collections that focus on the Revolutionary era: the Richard Brown map collection at Mount Vernon and the Seymour Schwartz collection at the University of Virginia. In their book, Revolution: Mapping the Road to American Independence, Richard Brown and his co-author, Paul Cohen, used these maps to tell the story of warfare in America. Seymour Schwartz, in his Mapping of America, a book co-authored with Ralph Ehrenberg, uses Revolutionary War maps to tell the story of how disconnected colonies became a united nation. Today, I've asked different questions about maps from these two remarkable Revolutionary era map collections. How did they reflect new military methods for surveying in war and peace? How did such maps influence the ways in which map readers imagined distant places? The American Revolution was a battle of ideas defined by notions of liberty, tyranny, slavery, and freedom, but it was also a series of engagements that took place in real geographic space. Warfare in North America opened up these spaces to view throughout the British world. On both sides of the Atlantic, book readers and map viewers watched an imperial world come together and fall apart in high resolution. What I've called the surveyor's eye was a rigorous way of looking at and representing geographic space. It zoomed in on sites of conflict and pictured the natural world with startling clarity. Such a view gained enormous authority in the second half of the 18th century. It gave commanders the confidence to dispatch forces to remote places And it created images in which map viewers immersed themselves as they meditated on the meanings of Britain's global empire. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions people have.
Yes, fascinating presentation. So
Thank you.
thank you. Just curious, did Native Americans make maps, and did these maps find their ways into British hands? And did they use the British surveyors you mentioned? Did they use Native American sources to build their maps?
Yes. So during the 7 Years' War, certainly Native Americans were used as scouts as guides extensively by the French and the British. But the record of Native American map making is pretty scarce. There are a few surviving examples of native maps. A famous one is called the Catawba deerskin map. It was a map of Catawba Indians and southeastern Indians as they were connected across space to Europeans. And it was literally painted on a processed deerskin and presented to South Carolina's governor. And these maps are fascinating because they show that Native Americans, like in the field, certainly had an incredible working knowledge of terrain and directions. But when it came time for Native Americans to depict the world, they didn't use European forms. They had their own forms. And it's hard to describe this map. If I had a picture of it, I would show you. But in some ways, it reminds me of the DC Metro map, right? It's a series of circles connected by a series of lines. It doesn't pay any attention to topography or any of the things I was talking about here. There are no hillsides or hashers. But what it is a social map of the southeastern world, where what mattered is how places and societies were connected to each other and linked together in commerce and alliance, which is how Native Americans, I think, tended to show geography. There's an incredible record, however, a textual record of native mapping, because Europeans were frequently getting lost in unfamiliar places in America. And when they would encounter Native Americans and ask for directions, Native Americans could draw remarkable maps that Europeans completely understood on the ground with a stick or a bit of charcoal. Of course, these ephemeral maps disappeared instantly, but it shows that Native Americans weren't necessarily surprised or impressed by British geographic knowledge. They had a working stock of knowledge that was in some ways superior. Mhm.
George Washington was a minor officer for the British during the French and Indian War and had been a surveyor before that. Does any of his work get involved in this, and do we have any samples of it?
So when Washington commanded troops in the Revolutionary War, his mapping skills were important, and he knew the value of those maps. During the 7 Years' War, as a young officer, he drew a map of the path to Fort Duquesne and the battle that he lost at Port Necessity. And of course, he spent his whole life mapping Mount Vernon and all the properties he owned around it. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, I was lecturing to my colonial America history students at UVA about the proclamation of 1763 and the famous proclamation line. And one of the questions I posed to them was, we know that George Washington remained an active land speculator throughout his career. Did George Washington actually violate the proclamation line by surveying lands near the Ohio River? And one of the things I tried to show was that Washington was very conscious of where this line was and how it was moving in negotiations. He wanted to get his land like all elites did, but he also was respectful of the British law that created the proclamation. So Washington and Jefferson, one of the maps I showed you was by Peter Jefferson and Joshua Fry, this map of Virginia. Jefferson grew up with his famous father, who was a surveyor and map maker, in a house full of maps and surveying instruments, and learned how to survey himself. So the American founders had a profound understanding of the importance of maps and mapping right from the beginning.
Dr. Edelson, we do have some questions from Zoom here. So our first one is, you mentioned when you were speaking about Thomas Jeffries, his title Geographer to the King. What exactly does that mean, and were there any benefits to that? How did that compare to other engravers or cartographers?
Yeah, so on many old maps, you'll find this notation that whoever the cartography was had an official title: cosmographer to the king, geographer to the king. For most of Britain's colonial history, that didn't mean much. It didn't come with any money. It didn't come with any special privileges, although it might have come with special privileges in terms of protecting the copyright of the map, although it was easy, as I've shown, to copy these maps without penalty. But Thomas Jeffreys was maybe the first to actually make use of this title because he used it to get his way into the official map archives that captured all these manuscript maps that military surveyors were producing in the field. And it was really a relationship of convenience. British officials wanted these maps published. French and Spanish official map makers tended to keep them as state secrets. They did not want them leaked out and published to a broad audience because they feared British and Dutch interlopers would come into their ports and take advantage of that. But the British wanted to show their mapping prowess because that helped them lay claim to the lands that they mapped if they had the most authoritative knowledge over those lands. So it was a relationship of convenience. The British published maps that they used for official purposes using commercial publishers. In fact, there's one collection that I like working with a lot. It's called the American Military Pocket Atlas. It's a sort of a synthesis of all this new survey knowledge about America. And it wasn't quite big enough, small enough to put in your pocket. So it's also called the American Military Holster Atlas. Every officer was issued one of these printed map books, and many of them had a special leather holster commission that it would fit into. And you can see how it would be valuable for officers spread across the Caribbean and North America to have the same maps of the same places as they were coordinating their military activities. So the British used commercial map makers, and especially those that had the title of map maker to the king or geographer to the king, used their access to manuscript maps in order to create these new records of empire.
Great to dovetail. That's a perfect dovetail into the next question. Did the Americans have access to these British maps?
Very much
Or is it
so.
more?
So in this talk, I mostly imagined the person reading these maps as a British armchair general sitting in his leather chair and his nice library with all these lovely expensive maps, imagining these battles back home. But Americans are also buying these maps. In fact, one of the things I write about in my recent book, A New Map of Empire, is the very first United States map collection, which was assembled by John Adams when he was Congress's appointee to head the War Department during the Revolutionary War. Adams, like every good military planner, knew that he needed a collection of maps in order to correspond with officers and direct the activities of the army. But the United States, if Britain isn't producing its own maps, you can imagine the new United States does not have its own cartographic service quite yet. So what Adams did is he wrote to his friends and in Europe and in America and said, collect all the best maps you can. And what were the maps that went into this first map collection that John Adams had for the United States? They were all these maps I've just shown you, all these old British maps created in the 1750s and 1760s. But in American hands, they had new meanings, right? They didn't imagine a great empire, they imagined a great nation, right? Taking this position in North America. So the same old maps had new meanings for Americans, and American officials were just as concerned about having good cartographic information as the British.
Great, thank you. We have one question. How did the cartographers achieve such incredible detail in the printed copies of their maps? He says it's clear that you need almost a magnifying glass to read all the detail.
Yeah, I mean, this is the challenge of teaching map history to modern students, right? We just have so many high resolution, compelling images coming at us all the time. We're bored with one, we go on to the next one. We go to the next TikTok, or we flip the channel, or move on to something else that will amuse or stimulate us. There's not so many amazing images like this in the 18th century world. And so maps were densely inscribed images. They were expensive, and people came back to them again and again. They found new details, new things to read, new places to reflect on. They were a kind of renewable resource of that kind of information. So map making in this era was something that this military style of map making was very zoomed in, and these maps were created using usually a process called plane table surveying. This involved surveyors out in the landscape with a plane table and telescopes and other equipment so that they could create a triangulated network of positions along a coastline. So the reason these maps are so detailed is because there are human beings rigorously representing them with a pretty rigorous system for creating a proportional view of complicated coastlines. So that detail is the result of on-site observation and a lot of expensive, careful surveying that was done over many months.
Great. And there was not just from your entire talk, we all gathered that there was an obvious push to survey as much as possible in North America, the West Indies. Was there a similar push in other places in the British Empire, say India, for example?
Very much so. So there's a parallel survey in India that takes place right around the same time. As Britain is fighting these great wars for its American empire in the 18th century, the East India Company is strengthening its position in India. And as people are debating Britain's precarious but also dominant position in the world, it's how much debt it's acquired to fund all these long distance colonies. They talked as much about India as they did about America at times. They knew that new revenue from these new colonies in the East was going to be at least as important as the colonies in the West. So there's a whole different story to tell. In fact, the map historian Matthew Edney has written a wonderful book on the mapping of India in this period. By the 19th century, the British were surpassing what they'd done in America. They created the first great, what's known as a geodetic triangulation survey, not only a super high resolution survey, but one that takes the very curvature of the Earth's surface into account to produce incredibly rigorous representations of space. So this process of mapping empire continued even after the United States was formed and no longer part of the empire.
Now, there was a question about, did the surveyors that you mentioned before the American Revolution, did any of them side with the Americans? Were they working for Washington, or did they mostly stay with the British? And if they did, how did the Americans train their surveyors, map makers in the field?
Yeah, I mean, the most well-regarded person along those lines was Thomas Hutchinson, or maybe it's Hutchins. I may have gotten that name wrong. He was a British surveyor who became an American surveyor and became one of the first lead geographers of the United States, created remarkable new maps of the Trans-Appalachian West that were so important in America's expansion in the 19th century. William de Brom had a very eccentric career after he was captured during the American Revolutionary War. He was the surveyor who mapped South Carolina and the Florida Keys. He ended up returning to America as a kind of Quaker mystic. And so he, in a sense, sided with the Americans, but he no longer did so as a map maker. Map makers understood, most of these map makers are not from elite backgrounds. They worked their way up through these army appointments and into the officer ranks, and they knew that they had a distinctive and valuable skill. So they were always on the look for how they could use their mapping skills to get a promotion. And during the war, Americans needed map makers too. So some went over to the American side, and some remained British map makers.
Great, thank you. And I think that's a good place to wrap everything up. You pretty much answered, you were killing two birds with one stone for some of those questions. So thank you very much. I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight in person and on Zoom, and especially to Dr. Edelson for joining us here at Anderson House tonight, and for all of your continued support of our mission. So thank you very much. Get home safe, and we will see you next time. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.